Hi, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm very excited to have a very special guest with me today, Rod Dreher. Rod, thanks for joining.
Aaron, it's great to finally get together with you online like this.
I agree. Thanks so much for doing it. And you are the man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce you anyway. So, Rod Dreher is a senior editor at the American Conservative. He's also the publisher of the Daily Dreher on Substack. I'm a subscriber. You should be a subscriber too. It's a great daily update that's very different from the blog. It's very reflective. It's about kind of spiritual things, culture in this world, really interesting. And then he's also the author of the new book, Live Not by Lies, which you should definitely buy. It's a great book. You should also pick up, there it is. I'm glad you have it. I was going to actually, display it, but I bought it on Kindle. So it was not quite as impressive to hold up my Kindle. So thanks for doing that. And again, the link to buy that and the Benedict Option, a great companion volume, are in the show notes. And again, don't forget, hit subscribe on YouTube. Please do subscribe if you're not already. And if you're not on the Masculinist Monthly newsletter, by all means, please go to the Masculinist and sign up because you won't want to miss that. So Rod, thanks again for joining.
Again, it's great to be here. The issues that I talk about in Live Not by Lies, that I talk about every day on my blog, they're becoming more and more relevant. Just today, as you and I are talking, the Senate is hearing testimony on the Equality Act, which, if it passes, will dramatically restrict religious liberty in this country. So these aren't abstract issues, Aaron. These are very, very real for Christians in America and all people of faith whose faith contradicts the woke narrative.
How has the launch of the book been going so far? The reviews have been great.
Yeah. Well, the book came out September 29th. We can't plan these things. I turned in the final manuscript around this time last year. That was before COVID really kicked in. That was before George Floyd. And by the time the book came out September 29th of last year, the sales were off the charts because people knew that I wasn't just talking abstractly. They could see what was happening. And this book has sold more in 5 months than the Benedict Option sold in 4 years.
Wow.
So it's been big, and it continues to get more and more. The sales continue to grow because people, again, it's the news that's selling it for me. I've had no interest from mainstream media. I was on Tucker Carlson's show the night before before the book launched, and I was on Morning Joe once. But other than that, that's pretty much the only mainstream media attention I've had to this book, as opposed to the Benedict Option, which got a lot. This book is selling mostly through podcasts, through some radio appearances, and word of mouth as Christians read it and say, this is something serious. This is something that we need to talk about, something we need to prepare for.
With the Benedict Option, you're right, you get a lot of press and you get a lot of pushback from people. There were a lot of reviewers who said, oh, this is alarmist, this is this, they didn't like it. And this book seems, not everybody's liked it, but it seems to be getting much more positive reception, even though I don't think there's really any difference between the themes you were, highlighting in one versus the other. What do you think accounts for the difference in the reception of these books?
Time. People saw that the sort of things that I was talking about in Benedict Option, as you say, they're Live Not by Lies is just an extension of that. But people allowed themselves back in 2017 when Benedict Option came out, people allowed themselves the luxury of denial. But enough has happened in just the last 3-4 years to where people can't live in denial. It's a lot harder for them to live in denial now. I met a guy in Nashville, a pastor of a mega church in Portland, Oregon, last year. I drove up there for a socially distanced event. And he said, oh, Rod Dreher, I can remember when your book came out, The Benedict Option, everybody said, oh, Dreher's such an alarmist. He said, now we are living the reality you talked about in that book. And nobody says that anymore in Portland. And he told me, he says, what's happening today in Portland is going to happen all over the country eventually. We're living right on the front lines of it. And we can tell you that just in 3 years, we went from being thought of as pleasant eccentrics in our as Christians in Portland to being thought of as evil. And in just 3 years, it flipped like that. And it's going to happen everywhere eventually.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the urban, one of these prominent urban Christians that I know here, who I think he's progressive in a lot of ways. He's certainly not a culture war type by any means. He's been talking about how he's spending a lot of time in this smaller Indiana community where he kind of mentions like, oh, it's like there's not quite as woke here. It's a little more. It's like the air is a little clearer, you know what I mean? Sometimes, and so maybe it's like the law of merited impossibility finally came to life for people. That'll never happen, and when it does, you bigots will deserve it.
Well, Aaron, you said it so well. This is one of my first introductions to your work when you talked a few years ago in The Masculinist about the difference between positive culture, neutral culture, and negative culture. And so many Christians are still not able to understand that we are living in a time when to be a faithful Christian is to incur the wrath of the broader culture, and the sort of people. I think you mentioned Tim Keller. People like that are leaders of a neutral culture. Maybe you could expand a little bit on that, so we could talk about that, because I think that was one of the most important early insights that helped guide my thinking. The way you framed it.
Yeah, well, as I said, it used to be in America, like Christianity, being seen as a Christian was sort of seen as a positive social good. And maybe going back to the 50s would be the high watermark of that. If you wanted to be considered a good, upstanding citizen in America, you were a church-going person. It didn't necessarily matter what church you went to, but it was like that was part of like being an upstanding citizen. If you known as a good church-going man, you would actually get like extra social kudos maybe in society. And Christian morality had a certain normative force in our world as well. The laws of like sexual morality, like if you had an affair or something, that would be considered a big moral taint against you. Then, as I say, somewhere, I said 1994, and there's nothing magical about that date. We went into a situation, we'd been trending less away from Christianity for a while, but went through this threshold where Christianity was no longer seen as a social positive. But it was not seen as a negative either. It was sort of seen as what I call a neutral. It's like, great, you're a vegan, I'm a Christian, we're sort of all have our little things that we're into. It's a very pluralistic public square. And there certainly was still some, residual Christian moral force, I think, in society. But it was going away. I used the difference between what happened with Gary Hart when he got caught in an affair versus what happened with Bill Clinton when he got caught with Monica Lewinsky. Mm-hmm. Very different public outcomes demonstrating the difference between the positive and the neutral world era. Then I said 2014, probably again because the Obergefell decision was the year later, so I backed up a little bit. We went into what I call a negative world, where Christianity, to be known as a Christian today, is to be seen as a social status negative, particularly in upscale society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and is seen as a threat to the new public moral order and the new public morality, I think, in a lot of ways. So the culture is very actively hostile to Christianity now in a way that it was not before. And, I'm reminded of, when the Israelites, the Hebrews crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land for the first time, and the statement, I think, by Joshua was to follow the ark, stay back and follow the ark, because you've never been this way before. Mm-hmm. You're going into new territory. This is unexplored territory, and this is what we are. We're kind of in unexplored territory for us. None of us ever has a cultural experience with that.
No, and you saying that brings to mind something I read in the Washington Post just today. They have a story about the Equality Act coming before the Senate, and they quoted a young man named Sam Ruff, a Wheaton College undergraduate who heads up the LGBT group on campus. And Sam Ruff said that, in the quote, that there is no reason for any Christian to ever be opposed to LGBT rights. And he said, interesting, he said this, no reason at all. He said it's a false dichotomy. And he said he would rather see Wheaton University reduced, pay a big price for the sake of achieving LGBT rights. This is extraordinary. Here's a guy who's willing to see his institution that he chose to attend have to suffer so he can get what he wants. And he sees no reason at all why this shouldn't happen. I wonder if he really, in all honesty, doesn't see any reason, or whether he's ever been shown any reason. We certainly haven't seen any discussion in our media, not over gay marriage when that was an issue, and certainly not over transgender rights. We haven't seen any deep discussion of it, of what the trade-offs would be. I can remember back covering this as a journalist, covering the gay marriage issue starting around 2001, 2002. It was incredible how little attention the media paid deliberately to the other side of the issue. It's full advocacy journalism. I can remember being at the Dallas Morning News in those days where I worked and arguing with the journalists in the newsroom about how unfair our newspaper's coverage was of this issue. Dallas is perhaps, maybe next to Houston, is the most religiously engaged big city in America. And yet the newspaper was all in on advocacy journalism and would not be fair. And it ticked me off as a Christian in that newsroom. But I talked to a church-going colleague who said, would you think that if we were back in the civil rights era, that we had a journalistic obligation to give equal time to the Ku Klux Klan? He honestly thought that there was no difference between sexuality, sexual desire, and gender orientation and racism. It blows the mind. And of course, we haven't seen anything since then. When the trans issue came up, we haven't seen any kind of fair coverage to help Americans understand why this is a big deal. And so I think that we get a young man like Sam Ruff and a lot of other Christians I know who just don't understand it. They're like, why would you want to be mean? Because they think the ultimate point of Christianity is to be nice.
Well, I think that in the Benedict Option, you highlighted this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism, that kind of the belief, and I think be nice is almost a principle of that. Yeah.
I can remember being at an evangelical college in early 2017, giving a series of talks about the Benedict Option. And I gave a lecture about the importance of spiritual discipline in discipleship, that we can't just hold these thoughts in our hearts, these emotions in our hearts, these thoughts in our heads. We have to instantiate them into practices to build resilience and obedience. At the end of the lecture, a young woman raised her hand for Q&A and said, I just don't understand why you are talking about disciplines. Why isn't it enough to love Jesus with all our heart as our parents taught us? And I said, well, of course we have to love Jesus with all our hearts. That's the base, that's the foundation of it. But that has to be made concrete in practices. And I kind of went on to try to explain it. I could tell I was getting nowhere with her. After it was over, a professor came up to me and said, hey, the way that young woman thinks is the way 99% of our undergraduates on this campus think, because they've been raised in a church youth group culture that emphasizes feeling, that emphasizes relationality. And they haven't thought much about doctrine, about disciplines, things like that. So they come here to our school and they're in another evangelical bubble. But then when they get out into the world and they are told by the world that, hey, what you say you believe as a Christian, that's mean, that's hateful, they collapse because they have no discipline, because they never had discipleship.
Yeah. No, I think, and again, I guess it's the same in the Catholic world. I think you've written about that. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the lack of Catholic, call it, discipleship or catechesis or whatever. But a lot of the evangelical, kind of the big evangelical megachurch worlds, people I think do come out. I was kind of surprised myself because I was raised in a rural kind of fundamentalist church where, you were drilled in like the Bible and it was very hardcore. But a lot of these evangelical megachurches, people just, they come out of their youth group and go off to college. They really actually don't know much about Christianity. Right. I've talked to people who, they would be enthusiastic about Christianity coming out of that, and they're even asking me like, "What books can you give me on theology?" Because I don't think I understand anything.
Yeah, that's definitely true for the Catholics. I am Eastern Orthodox, as many of your viewers no doubt know, and I can't really say where we are as in the Orthodox Church because we're so small and we don't do the same sort of studies that the bigger churches do. But I would be very surprised if we were very different from evangelicals and Catholics. A couple months ago, back in January, I was tapped by St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, which is our big seminary in Orthodoxy, to come give their annual Schmemann lecture named after Father Alexander Schmemann, a leader of American Orthodoxy. And I was...
Is he the one that wrote For the Life of the World?
Yes,
Was
exactly.
that him? Yeah. That's a great book.
Yeah, he was a great man, and he comes from Russian exile stock. Like his family was thrown out of Russia after the revolution. Anyway, they wanted me to come talk about my book, Live Not by Lies, and what the witness of the underground church and the persecuted church in the Soviet bloc has to tell us today. Well, when that lecture was announced, there was a cadre of Orthodox academics, progressive academics, who raised hell about we can't let this guy come in there with his culture war. You can't let him come. He's not an academic. He's not a priest, and on and on and on.
Attacking your qualifications. That's
Right,
one of their
right.
favorite tactics.
Yeah,
You're not qualified.
credentialism. But thank God the seminary board stayed firm, and I gave the talk, and it was very well received. But it was a sign to me, as somebody who came out of the Catholic Church and has seen how this has worked in the Catholic Church, and also I think to Father Chad Hatfield, the rector, the Orthodox rector of the seminary, who came out of the Episcopal Church. We know how this goes. We know how the left within the churches tries to roll conservatives, small o Orthodox traditionalists, to try to tell them, got to be tolerant, you got to this, you got to that. And as soon as they get a foothold, soon enough that then we can't be tolerant of injustice, they say, and shut up the conservatives.
Right. So where did you get the title Live Not by Lies?
Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1974, just before he was expelled by the Soviets to the West, he sent out an essay, a communique to his followers there under the title Live Not by Lies. And in it, he said essentially, look, we can't overthrow this totalitarian government, but one thing we can do is withhold our consent to the lies that we all have to speak in order to participate in Soviet society. He said, we can't run out in the street corner and scream what we know to be true, but we can at least say we can at least refuse to say what we know is not true. So, he said, if you find yourself at a public meeting where lies are spoken and it is impossible to speak the truth, get up and walk out. He had practical examples like that of things people could do, so their consent would not be assumed. Now, at that point, in the last 20 years of the Soviet life, it was a period of what a Soviet political scientist called hypernormalization. In other words, it was a time when everybody in Soviet society knew it was all one big lie. Nobody believed in any of it, but they all knew they had to be seen to affirm the lie to stay out of trouble. Eventually, it all fell apart. Well, I think we are entering a hypernormalization period here in that same sense, when a lot of people don't believe this stuff, but everybody's scared to death to be seen to dissent from the lie, because there's a real cost to be paid if you don't go along with the various lies that we have to deal with. So what I want to do with this book is to take that spirit of Solzhenitsyn and bring it to American Christian readers, and not just Christian readers. I'm surprised by some Jewish readers, some Muslim readers, and even a couple of atheist readers who are unwoke. They've endorsed my book. People like Barry Weiss, Brett Weinstein, and his wife Heather Heying. All of them are atheists on the left, but they say this is an important book because the experience that Solzhenitsyn had, that Václav Havel, and all the dissidents, Christian and non-Christian, had in the Soviet bloc is very relevant to what we're dealing with now, even though ours is what I call a soft totalitarianism, not the hard totalitarianism of the Soviet years.
So your book is about life under communism for Christians?
It's what I've done is this. Back in 2015, Aaron, I got a call from a physician at the Mayo Clinic. We had a mutual friend in common, and the physician wanted to tell some journalists what he had heard. He called me and told me that his elderly mother lives with him and his wife. She had been in prison back in her youth in her native country, Czechoslovakia. They had put her in prison in the 1950s as a so-called Vatican spy. Her crime consisted of refusing to stop going to church prayer meeting at her Catholic church. She was thrown in prison, as many of the people in the church were, and she was tortured. When she was released, she came to America, married the man's father, and that was her life. But anyway, the old lady was telling her son, the things I see happening in America today remind me of what I saw in my country when communism came. I thought that was just kind of crazy. My mom is old. She lives at lives alone at home. She's a widow. She watches a lot of cable news. She's always worked up about something. So I thought maybe that's what it is. But over the next few years, I made it a point to ask people whenever I would go to conferences or give speeches, and I would meet someone who grew up in the Soviet bloc or Soviet Union. I would ask them, are you seeing things now here in America that remind you of what you left behind? Every single one of them, Aaron, said yes. And if you talk to them long enough, they get really mad that Americans are blowing them off. So what are they seeing? Primarily, it's what we now call cancel culture. It's the idea that you must assent to a particular ideological line coming from the left. And if you don't, you could lose your job. You could be the victim of a mob, a social media mob. You could lose your reputation, and so on and so forth. This is how it starts, but it doesn't end there. So what I did in the book was, after I talked to enough of them and realized I have a book here, the first half of my book is talking about the conditions happening here in our country, in our society, that make them say this is a form of totalitarianism. Second half of the book is based on interviews I did by going over to the former Soviet bloc countries, interviewing Christians who were dissidents back in the day, and asking them, what do we in the American church and the church in the West need to know to prepare ourselves for resisting this new kind of totalitarianism? Now, it's a complicated thing because one Slovak priest said, this is more difficult than communism in a certain way, because under communism, he said, the light of the gospel shone a clear path through the darkness. But now when the gospel shines into what we're dealing with, it only hits fog. And so they know that they're having to deal with it too, and it's a softer form of totalitarianism, because let's back up a little bit. Authoritarianism is a political, or it's what you have in a society when all political authority is monopolized by one leader or party. Totalitarianism is an extreme form of authoritarianism. Political authority is all monopolized, but everything in the society is deemed political. Well, when we hear the word totalitarianism, people like me who grew up during the Cold War, the last decades of the Cold War, we naturally think of the Soviet Union. We think of George Orwell's 1984. Because we don't see that or prospects for that coming upon us now, we think that people who say totalitarianism is emerging are crazy or alarmist. But in fact, if you look at the other great dystopian novel of the 20th century, Brave New World by Huxley, you begin to better understand what we're dealing with here. In Brave New World, the totalitarian state manufactured or compelled consent from the people, not by filling them full of pain and terror, of torture and prison and all that, but rather by manipulating their access to comfort. And so you have that great scene at the end where John the Savage, the dissenter in Brave New World, confronts Mustafa Mond, one of the world controllers. Now, if you think back to 1984, when O'Brien the torturer meets Winston Smith, he's ready just to do terrible things to him to make him love Big Brother. That's not how Mustafa Mond works in Brave New World. He says to John, look, why don't you want to be part of this society? We've got drugs, we've got all the sex you want, entertainment. It's a great place to be. You don't have to worry about anything. He even uses the phrase, it's Christianity without tears. And the savage says, who's been raised outside the society on Shakespeare, living in the wild, he says, I want sin, I want love, I want beauty, I want joy. He wants to live. He wants to be fully human. And the savage knows that you can't be fully human if you're not prepared to suffer, to accept suffering and discomfort and imperfection. That's what it means to be human. So what does Mustafa Mond say? He goes, good luck. You're welcome to it. And I think that's what we're dealing with now. I brought that whole episode up of Mustafa Mond and John the Savage meeting on a tram in Budapest. I was going through the city with my translator when I was reporting the book over there. And she was a young woman, maybe 29 years old, married 5 years, had one small child at home and one on the way. And she's a Catholic, a practicing Catholic. And she said, Rod, I really do struggle with my own Christian friends here. I try to tell them that, maybe I'm having trouble in my marriage, or it's hard to raise a kid. Just normal things that normal people go through. And as soon as I open my mouth, they say, oh, divorce your husband, or put your kid in daycare, go back to work. You, be happy, live your own truth. She said, I want to tell them, wait, you don't understand. I love my husband. I love being a mom, but just life can be hard sometimes. I just want to talk about it with my friends, but none of them get it. They all insist that life, the good life, is a life that is as free of struggle and as free of anxiety as possible. I looked at her and said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. Where did you get that? Well, chapter 17 of Brave New World, Mustafa Ahmad says to John the Savage, you're fighting for your right to be unhappy.
Well, that's the human, that's the human condition, and I think that ultimately, and we see this in our world, the idea that you can eliminate unhappiness ends up in the long term making us more unhappy.
Yeah.
I think in a longer thing over the course of a lifetime, for sure.
Well, it does, and it makes you susceptible to totalitarian control, because when you see all these young people at universities going to the authorities to demand that those who make them anxious by the use of the different language or whatever be punished and suppressed, that is telling them we don't want freedom. We can't handle freedom because it makes us anxious. I think one of the seminal events of our time occurred in Yale University in 2015, in the fall of 2015. You can see all this play out on YouTube, by the way. That was when the university sent out a missive to all the students at Yale about Halloween, saying, be careful what you wear for Halloween. You don't want to trigger anybody, cultural appropriation, blah, blah, blah. Well, Erica Christakis, she and her husband, Nicholas Christakis, distinguished Yale faculty members. They were also like the house parents in a particular college. Erica sent out a note to all the students in her college saying, really? Is it really the place of a university to tell legal adults what they can and can't wear on Halloween? The students there exploded in rage at Erica Christakis, and saying that you don't care about us, you're supposed to protect us, you don't care. You can see on YouTube a meeting that her husband Nicholas had on the quad with a mob of these students, and he's trying to engage them in.
They're all surrounding him. It's like,
yeah, they are. They're surrounding him, and they're hysterical, and they're screaming. Some of them are sobbing. They're cursing him, and he's just trying to engage them in reasoned dialogue. They're not having it. And of course, Yale University after that took the side of the students. Erica Christakis is no longer there. And this sent a message to all professors and everybody on staff that if you dissent from what this woke social justice warrior student mob wants, then we will not stand behind you. I think that this is right there. You see in embryo how these students are preparing themselves for totalitarianism. They demand it. They demand that the authorities protect them from having to confront a thought that makes them anxious.
What is the relationship between Live Not by Lies with the Benedict Option?
Well, the Benedict Option, I wrote this book. It's something I've been thinking of for a long time, since the mid-2000s. After reading Alistair McIntyre's 1981 classic of moral philosophy, After Virtue. And in that book, McIntyre says that basically we've come to the end of the road with the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment tried to form ways of thinking about morality that didn't depend on religion or religious revelation. And we found out that we really can't do that effectively. And that's why, said McIntyre, so many of our public arguments don't ever get anywhere, because people are arguing from such different premises. McIntyre said that our public statements become not so much statements of rationality, but statements of emotion, emotivism, he called it. Anyway, that's a simplified version of what he said. But it really, when I first encountered that in the mid-2000s, it really helped me understand our public discourse such as it is. I was on the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News then, and I thought, so this is why things, we're talking past each other all the time. Well, in the final paragraph of After Virtue, McIntyre likens our situation today in the West to that of the late Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire, and its fall. And he said that there came a time in history when a group of people who were devoted to the virtues. I mean, he wasn't a Christian at that time, so he's talking about the Benedictine monks. He said they realized that they weren't going to try to stand up the empire, that the empire was lost, and if they wanted to preserve the virtues, they would need to form small communities within which these traditions can live through the dark ages upon them. And MacIntyre said, we are waiting, therefore, for another, doubtless very different Saint Benedict. Well, Benedict of Nursia was a monk who was raised a Christian, born right after the fall of the Roman Empire, but went down to Rome to get his education. He saw the chaos there and said, I can't live this way as a Christian. So he just went out to the woods to pray and to seek God's will. Ended up founding a monastic movement. What God did with that monastic movement over the so-called Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, those monasteries that spread throughout Western Europe became lighthouses in that darkness. They became fortresses of prayer. They evangelized people, the monks did. They taught them things like how to live, how to grow things that had been lost when Rome fell. And eventually they laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization in Western Europe. So what I call the Benedict option then is a call that for all Christians who are, I call them small o orthodox, those who are more or less conservative, though politics doesn't have anything to do with it, theologically conservative Christians, to realize that we are in a post-Christian nation now. We're in a post-Christian society. And the thing that we need to do more than anything else is to shore up our base. In other words, to go deeper into Scripture, go deeper into our traditions, build resilient, thick fellowships of other believers so that we can withstand, with our faith intact, what is to come in this new dark age. Now, a lot of people said, oh, you're just saying head for the hills. No, I'm not. The people who say that have not read the book. I don't think there's any place to escape what's coming. But what I say we should do is to withdraw to a certain extent from participating in the mainstream of society for the sake of building up our faith and being able, so that when we go out into the world as we must, we can faithfully represent Christ. But if you don't have some sort of walls, figuratively, between yourself and the world, then the culture out there is so toxic and so powerful, it's going to overwhelm your Christian consciousness. I talk in the book about this monastery that's now in Norcia, the home of St. Benedict. It's a Benedictine monastery there. And I went to talk to some of the monks and to the abbot. And he said, we have these walls here at the monastery. We're very open to the world. People come here all the time to pray, to attend mass, sometimes we counsel people. But when the Benedictine rule, the rule of life that the monks had, when it says, okay, it's time to shut the doors to the monastery and go pray or go do scripture study or whatever they have to do, we do that because, said the abbot, if we didn't do that, if we kept our doors open all the time to people, they would never stop coming, and we could not be for them what God calls us to be when they come. In other words, their fidelity, their ability to serve the world as monks depends on being able to step back for periods and recharge. In the same way that Christ would go into the woods and pray and think before he would go out to exercise in ministry.
I've had a lot of debates with different Protestants about the Benedict option. And I think from a Protestant perspective, one of the reasons that they were, negative, maybe a little negative towards it is because, a lot of Protestants are kind of allergic to anything too Catholic. Yeah. And the monasticism strikes them as very, very Catholic. And sure. I think, you were, one of the things you were really emphasizing the community aspect of monasticism, the stability aspect of monasticism, whereas I think that they really, emphasize the walls. But I always told people, and I still think this is true, it's like, we have to go with Great Commission and Great Commission. I'm like, you can't give people something you don't have yourself.
Exactly.
And I think that's the mission of the Benedict option is you got to have something to give something. And
exactly.
Right now we're kind of running on fumes. Our communities are running on fumes.
We are, Aaron, and that's what Christian Smith at Notre Dame saw with his moralistic therapeutic deism research, that across all Christian churches in America, evangelicals are a little better than the non-evangelicals, but all Christian churches in America are running on fumes because we have had at least two generations where we have taught nothing. We have formed nobody. Christianity has just been assumed, and we've been depending on a culture around us not to be hostile. Well, those days are over. And you ask what's the difference, or what's the connection between Benedict Option and Live Not by Lies. The thing that both of them have in common is this trying to wake up the church to the threats, not threats, multiple threats coming not only to Christian institutions like schools and churches, but to Christian families, Christian individuals, Christian-owned businesses from this increasingly hostile culture. And Live Not by Lies is maybe a sharpening of the Benedict Option to say that that this is coming, and it's going to be aggressive, and we have got to form dispositions within ourselves as believers to withstand that, but also form networks of mutual support. I dedicate the book to a Catholic priest named Father Tomislav Kolakovich. He was a Jesuit who was born and raised and served in Croatia. And in 1943, he was doing anti-Nazi work there, and he got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him. So he slipped out of the country, went to Slovakia, his mother's homeland nearby, and adopted her last name and began teaching in a Catholic university. And he told his students, he goes, look, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is that the Soviets are going to be ruling this country when it's over, and the first thing they're going to do is come after the church. So we've got to get ready. What he did was form these small groups they were students, really. Those were the people he was able to talk to. They would come together for prayer, but not just for prayer, but for study, to study the world around them in light of the gospel, in light of their church's teachings, and to figure out what can we do to get ready for this coming persecution. These groups that he founded spread quickly throughout the country. By 1945, 46, any town of any size in Slovakia had one of these Kolakovich prayer groups. He called them the family. The bishops in Slovakia warned him. It's like, look, don't do this. You're scaring people. You're being an alarmist. It'll never happen. But Father Kolakovich had studied the Soviet mindset when he was in seminary because he wanted to be a missionary to the Soviet Union. And he knew that the bishops were completely naive. Sure enough, they kicked him out. After the war was over, the government kicked him out. And when the Iron Curtain came down on his country, the first thing they did was come after the churches. Because in the communist theory, in Soviet practice, they figured that if they can just grab the priest and shut the church down, everything would be done. Kolakovich understood this, which is why he prepared the laity, the Catholic laity in that country, along with sympathetic priests, to continue the life of the church underground under duress. If Father Kolakovich had not done what he did, if he had listened to the bishops and stood down, things would have gone much easier for the communist attempt to crush the church. But because he did what he did, and because followers were willing to put their lives on the line and even go to prison to defend Christ and the underground church, there was a church there for 40 years, and it formed the primary opposition to communist totalitarianism. It was the Slovak underground church that in 1988 called the first major demonstration in that country since the Soviet invasion in 1968. It was the candle demonstration in Bratislava, where they've produced 10,000 people on the square to hold candles at night and to pray and sing hymns. The communist government was caught off guard. They sent in water cannons. You can see all this on YouTube now. But this was a magnificent show of force, and it kicked off the Velvet Revolution that a year later ended communism. I think, Aaron, that we are in a Kolakovich moment here in the United States. We are living in freedom now, but we can see we can hear the drum beats on the horizon. We can see the lights going out in this country for religious liberty and for Christians who are traditionalists and who go up against the social justice warriors on questions of race or sexuality. And we have got to prepare ourselves and our families and our churches and our networks while we have the liberty to do so.
Well, again, I agree. And again, I think everybody who's out there, we're talking about Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher, also the Benedict Option by Rod Dreher, the great 2 companion volumes. Maybe there'll be a third one and make it a trilogy at some point, but buy them today. Also hit the subscribe button. If you're not already subscribed on YouTube, hit subscribe and go to themasculinist.com and get on the newsletter if you're not already. I want to dig more into the book, but before I do that, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about you. And part of that is just selfish because I feel like I've got little bits and pieces of your biography over the years from your blog, but I don't feel like I know the whole story. And then I think that there's a little bit sense in which we have some somewhat parallel lives in that we both grew up in rural areas and kind of flyover country, went away to the big city, and now we're kind of back in our home state. So I always like to compare notes with people like that. So I kind of wanted to talk about like how you got to now and how it is that like you end up writing these kinds of books, because I think a lot of things are very related to our biography. And so I was like, where did you grow up?
Well, I'm living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana right now, but I grew up in a little town 30 miles north of Baton Rouge on the Mississippi River, a place called St. Francisville. And it was Mayberry-like, right? A beautiful place to grow up, but I didn't really feel that I fit there because I was more bookish. And, my dad, my late father, was a big hunter and athlete, like most of the men are, and I just didn't fit in. But we were Methodists, but we were Christmas and Easter Methodists. We knew that we were going to heaven because we were Methodists, and so we didn't really have to go to church that often. And that was the way I was raised. That was how a lot of people I knew were raised. When I got to be a teenager, I just wanted nothing to do with this anymore because it just seemed like bourgeois hypocrisy. I remember I got into a big argument with my dad once when I was a junior in high school. I said, look, I don't even think I believe in God anymore. So why should I go to church with mom and my younger sister on Easter Sunday? He goes, well, you're going to church. I said, well, why are you not going to church? Well, I'm going turkey hunting. I'm like, wait a minute. So anyway, I made a deal with him, and because he wasn't going to not go turkey hunting. But after that, I said, I'm never going to take anything they say about religion seriously. But my mother won a trip to Europe in a church raffle when I was 17. And she didn't want to go. So she sent me because she knew I was interested in art museums and Ernest Hemingway, and I wanted to go to Paris. So I was the only young person on a bus, a coach full of elderly Americans on this guided tour. But I didn't care, man. I was going to Paris. On the way to Paris, the bus pulls over at about an hour outside the city so we can go see another old church. And I thought, man, all right, I could wait on the bus for an hour for these old people, but maybe I should just go in. Well, I walked into the church, Aaron, and this was the cathedral, the medieval cathedral at Chartres in France. Mm-hmm. I had no idea at the time, but this is considered one of the great historical treasures of world architecture. I walked into this medieval Gothic cathedral, and Aaron, I was overwhelmed by the presence of God. There was nothing in my growing up in small town rural Louisiana in the late 20th century that prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in the stones and the stained glass of this medieval cathedral. And I had no defense against it. And I remember standing there at the center of the labyrinth there, looking up at all the stained glass and the stonework, and feeling that God was saying to me, I do exist and I want you. Well, I didn't walk out of that cathedral as a reverted Christian, but I did walk out of there on a search that took me through a lot of agony and, intellection and dying to self over the next few years in college and out. But I finally surrendered to Christ fully when I was 24 or 25, and I became a Catholic. But by then I was working in Washington, D.C. I'd gotten into journalism because I was so curious about the world. I was interested in politics and cultural ideas, but I didn't have the temperament or the discipline to study it academically. So, but I thought, I could be a journalist and write about it. And ended up in Washington in the 1990s and felt very strongly at the time that I was part of a tribe. I was a Catholic, and I wanted to be aligned with the Catholic intellectuals because ours was the best church, the smartest church, the oldest church. And look, the Catholic Church didn't teach me that. This was part of my own vanity. Mm-hmm. And I became very tribalistic about my Catholicism. And then I ended up getting married, moved to New York. I was a film critic at the New York Post and then became a columnist there, and then started writing about the abuse scandal in 2001. Before it broke big out of Boston, I started writing about it in New York. And I had a priest tell me, a really brave Catholic priest who had really sacrificed a lot to stand up for victims. After my interview, I said to him, he said to me, Rod, I can tell you're serious about your faith, and I want to warn you that if you keep going down this path of investigation, you're going to places darker than you can even imagine. I said, well, gosh, thanks, Father, for telling me that. But I feel like I need to do this because not only is this my church and not only is this an issue of justice, but I have a newborn son and I want to defend him. He goes, no, God bless you for that, but I just want you to be prepared. Well, I wasn't prepared, Aaron.
Were you a columnist at the paper or you were a reporter at this time?
Yeah, I was a columnist at the Post, and then I moved over to National Review at the beginning of 2002. And I continued. That's when the things broke big in Boston, and I really started writing about it then. And Aaron, it turned out he was right. The priest was right. There was nothing in my life that had prepared me for what I saw. I always figured that as long as I had the syllogism straight in my head, that I could make the apologetics arguments for Catholic authority, that I'd be fine. But there was, just the evil and the lies. Cardinal McCarrick, who's now been disgraced, I had a tip that he was an abuser of seminarians and all that, and started trying to report on it. Somebody tipped off McCarrick. He called my boss, Rich Lowry, and tried to get Rich to pull me off the story because, according to his lawyer, it was the lawyer that called Rich. He said, we know Rod Dreher is going to report something true about the cardinal, but it's not criminal. We want to get him pulled off. Well, Rich didn't pull me off the story, but he didn't have to, because the priests who were telling me about this, who had firsthand knowledge, none of them would go on the record. They wanted somebody to do something about it, but none of them wanted to take the risk to themselves and their ministry to tell the truth about this corrupt, wicked cardinal. But I had to live with that as a Catholic. I had to watch McCarrick go on Meet the Press with Tim Russert and say, oh, we didn't know it was so bad as this. We're going to fight. Because McCarrick was the guy who was taking the lead. The Vatican gave him to take the lead in fixing the American church. All of this just obliterated my ability to believe as a Catholic. I always thought that I had no idea how much the will was involved in there. And I just did not have it in me to believe anymore. One day, the day came when I just couldn't believe that my salvation depended on being in unity with the See of Rome. So, but as a Catholic, I believe that the Orthodox Church had valid sacraments. And my wife and I went over there one day in Dallas to the Orthodox Cathedral, not intending to convert at all, but just because we wanted to be around the place where Christ was truly present in the Eucharist, and the liturgy was beautiful, without having this constant anger and this fear for our children there. And eventually we became Orthodox, but I became a very different kind of Orthodox Christian, Aaron, because God had allowed me to be humiliated in my intellectual pride. I had assumed so much about and projected so much onto the Catholic institution. And as an Orthodox Christian, I said, I can't be that guy. I can't be the guy who gets caught up in church politics. I have to be humble and focus on my own repentance and my own salvation. And that's what I've tried to do. And I have not gotten involved in church politics, which is easier to do in the Orthodox Church because we're so small. But I have tried my very best to reach out to Christians, Catholics, evangelicals, others, to build other believers up where they are. It's not that I don't believe in what orthodoxy and denominational distinctives. I do. But I was so badly burned by my own pride and being humiliated by seeing it all fall apart that I just want to be a different kind of Christian.
I'm curious, how has orthodoxy itself affected your belief system? The things that you're writing, how much of them are informed specifically by orthodoxy?
That's a really interesting question. On my my Substack newsletter, which thank you for mentioning it, it's a spiritual exercise for me, that newsletter. I write it 5 days a week, and I deliberately force myself to focus on things that are good, true, and beautiful, things that give us reason to hope and to persevere in the face of all the garbage thrown at us. Because on my blog, that's like, that blog writes itself. There's always something really serious. I'm not looking for
No,
clickbait.
it doesn't write itself. People have accused me of, being, Aaron, you're the most prolific writer I know. I'm like, I'm not sure how to take that. Is that supposed to be a compliment? But
Yeah.
you blow me away. The production of content that you put out there is incredible. Nobody's as productive as you are.
Well, thank you.
But but continue.
No, but it's just there. It's so easy to find things to be alarmed by and genuinely alarmed by. I never put anything up for the sake of clickbait, and I feel this deep urge to wake up the church to what is going on, and there's such a resistance to it. But that's my mission. But on the blog, on the newsletter, I feel that I have to recharge. I have to realize that there's more to life than just and more to the Christian walk than just to point out all the bad things. And believe it or not, I work 4 hours a day on that newsletter, and it is the hardest work I do all day and it's probably therefore the most necessary work I do, just to kind of keep my eyes on the prize. And orthodoxy really informs much more on the newsletter than it does in my actual work. But I think that the way orthodoxy has affected me most of all, and I know this must affect my journalism, is it has compelled me to realize that orthodoxy has that faith is not just intellection, that you've got to get outside your head, that to be a Christian is more than just reaching the right conclusions. Theological conclusions. It has to be something that fills your entire life. The orthodoxy can be very deep intellectually, but it keeps front and center the idea that the conversion of the heart is the most important thing, and that is something that is been hard for me to accept, because it's just my nature that if I have a problem, I feel like, there must be an answer in one of these books, and my house is full of books. And I would normally go to the books and look for the answer. Well, maybe the answer would be there, but there's no substitute for prayer. I remember when I moved back to my native Louisiana in 2011 from Philadelphia after the death of my younger sister. My wife and I felt that we really needed to be back home to help take care of my mom and dad, because I was the only kid left after my sister died, and to help my brother-in-law with with the 3 kids that he had, my widowed brother-in-law. And, we moved back down here and things did not go well. I had learned some things about my family that just couldn't be fixed. And I fell into a very, very deep depression, got physically sick from all the anxiety and depression. I had chronic mono. But my priest at the time, my Orthodox priest, we had a small mission parish in my town. He assigned me to pray the Jesus prayer 500 times a day. Now, in the
500?
Yeah, which it would take about an hour the way we pray it, because the Jesus prayer is very simple. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And if you do it as Orthodox do, you clear your mind and then you breathe like, Lord Jesus Christ, breathe in, Son of the living God, breathe out, have mercy on me, a sinner. It takes a long time to do that because, Aaron, I don't know if you've tried to clear your mind if you have a very pure mind where no thoughts cross it. It takes work. I did this out of obedience, and it took me over an hour every day to do it. And I didn't understand it because it was really, it would have been easier to climb a mountain than to clear my busy mind. But I finally, after a couple of months, I really got into the rhythm of it, and it began to open a place in me, my heart, of stillness, kind of like a beachhead for the Holy Spirit to start working on me. And I became calmer and more open to God, and I became less anxious. And eventually I was healed. And there was more to it than just the Jesus prayer, but I remember talking to my priest and saying after I was well again and restored, I said, how did you know that's what I needed? He said, simple. You had to get out of your head. I knew you had to get out of your head.
Yeah.
And he was so wise about that, because he knew I was the kind of guy who, if he had given me 10 books to read, I would have jumped on that right away, and it wouldn't have helped me.
I'm the same way. Let's try to reason my way out of this problem.
Exactly. and this was not something I could reason my way out of. And, at the same time, when all this was happening, I went to see a rheumatologist who said, you've got chronic mono, and you are therefore 33 times more likely to get lymphatic cancer if you continue having this. He said, I see no way for you to get well unless you move away from Louisiana. I said, well, I can't do that. My mom and dad are here, and I've told my wife and kids, we've moved so many times, I just can't do that to them again. he looked at me and said, well, you better find inner peace some way because you're going to kill yourself like this. So around this time, my wife told me to start seeing a therapist, which I resisted, but then I was flat on my back, sleeping like 6 hours a day in the middle of the day because I was so exhausted. I also went into a bookstore here in Baton Rouge. I was in the poetry section one day, which is unusual for me because I'm not a big reader of poetry. And there on the top shelf was the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri. And I thought, I wish I had read that in college or in high school, but I missed my time. There's no way I can understand this medieval Tuscan poetry. But I pulled it off the shelf anyway and opened to the first page. And it said, the opening lines of the poem, in the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the straight path. Well, Aaron, I'm 46 years old. I'm standing there. I thought I'd come home to complete the circle. I'm home with my family and everything's going to be great. And nothing was great. It was all shattered, all my illusions. And I was in a dark wood. I thought, maybe this guy, Dante, has something to tell me. Well, to make a long story short, I ended up getting the book and reading the Divine Comedy, which was a story of a man in exile, thrown into exile in the middle of his life, trying to find his way back to wholeness, which for him and for me was back to God, back to union with our Lord. And I would read the Divine Comedy almost prayerfully and go to confession. I'm, as Orthodox have confession, I would go to my priest, and I remember telling him once, I'm an idol worshiper. He said, You're what? I said, I am an idol worshiper. I'm reading Dante, and I've come to understand in a way I never did before that I made my father into God and didn't know I was doing it. And that's why I've never really believed that God loves me. I know that God loves me, but I always thought he didn't approve of me the same way my father here on earth did. And I was wrong about that, and I want to repent. Aaron, when I started doing this sort of thing, combined with the prayer and also the therapy, I began to get better and I began to sort things out. My life became ordered. And eventually, before my dad died, we were able to reconcile. I was able to hold his hand and pray for him on his deathbed in 2015 when he died. But it all came to me through the non-rational, strictly rational means. It came to me through the Jesus prayer, praying that very meditatively, but also getting into reading Dante. And I discovered, as I was researching the book I wrote, How Dante Can Save Your Life, about this whole process, I discovered that neuroscientists have been able to prove that when people encounter data that comes to them in a nonfiction form, it affects their brains a certain way. But when they encounter the same truth claims made or embedded in fictional form, it goes much deeper. So if you are, they measured this on brain waves. If you're reading a book about a man walking up a mountain, the parts of your brain that would normally light up when you yourself are walking up a mountain also light up when you imagine it. So this is why, going back to think about the truths, about the psychological truths and spiritual truths that I encountered in Dante, I had so many defenses against them built up from my constant reading of nonfiction. But somehow, because they came embedded in this beautiful poetry, this incredible story, it flew right below radar and got me in the heart and led me to deep, deep repentance and restoration. So that is a way of answering how you got to where you are now. That's a big part of it too. God renewed me from this suffering, this most intense suffering of my life after my sister died, and to get home and realize that things were not what I thought they were with my family. That broke me. But it was necessary for it to happen, that suffering to happen, in order for me to come to know the Lord in a much deeper way and to be reconciled with my father before he passed.
You mentioned the suffering that you went through moving back to Louisiana, the suffering that you went through with your loss of faith through the Catholic abuse scandals. How does the suffering you've experienced relate to the way you talk about suffering, like live by not by lies?
Oh, thank you for that question. Well, one of the things I learned from talking to people in Eastern Europe and Russia about the dissident experience is that if you are not prepared to suffer for your faith doesn't mean anything. And I was able to discern in writing this book that this is the keystone right there. The ability as Christians to suffer for Christ and to understand what it means, the suffering dimension of the Christian life, because as believers, we don't have any right to be optimistic, but we have not only a right, but a responsibility to be hopeful. What's the difference there? An optimist is someone who believes that everything's always going to work out no matter what. Well, that's not really true. Ask the martyrs if everything worked out for them. Ask our Lord who was crucified. But for Christians, hope is the belief that even if things don't work out like we want them, that as long as we can unite our suffering to Christ, that the Lord will use it for our redemption and healing and for the redemption and healing of the world. So this is why Christian martyrs can go to their death praising God, because they know that they get to wear a crown. You know, that what the world thinks of as foolishness, as defeat, is actually, when united to Christ, victory. Well, I've been able to live through that in my own life. I never imagined that I could lose my Catholic faith, but it did happen. And it happened because I was blind to certain things in my own heart, and was so full of pride about being Catholic that I did not do the things that I ought to have done to prepare myself to suffer. I can remember, Aaron, back when I first started getting interested in Catholicism, it was in summer of 1991. I was working at the newspaper in Baton Rouge, and I was really starting to explore it, to feel like, God is calling me there. And there was a woman there who worked as a photographer, and she said, "Oh, I hear you're interested in being Catholic." Well, I'm Catholic, and I do a lot of volunteer work with the Missionaries of Charity soup kitchen downtown. This is Mother Teresa's nuns. You ought to come down there with us and help out. And I remember thinking, oh, that sounds very Catholic. I'll do it. So I went there one Saturday afternoon, and they put me to work just peeling potatoes, chopping carrots, whatever. And that was that. And I remember thinking at the end, I don't know what I expected, maybe some mystical experience with a nun. But I remember thinking, well, this was fine, but really I'm more of an intellectual, and my time would be better spent reading books about the faith. I never went back to the soup kitchen. So fast forward about 14 years later, my Catholic faith is in complete ruins. And I thought about that. I thought, if I'd spent at least half as much time in the soup kitchen or doing things like that I did with my head stuck in a book, maybe my faith would have survived this. So, but the suffering of losing that faith made me come to see not only what I needed to do to hold on to my faith, but what it meant to be Christian. Before, I would have said that to be a Christian is to assent intellectually to a bunch of propositions. Now, I do believe that's important, but what I had to come to understand in my brokenness is that the truth that saves is not a point of doctrine, but a man, the God-man, Jesus Christ. And I remember when I became Orthodox, I was still I couldn't get it all sorted clearly in my head. I would read something about papal supremacy and I would think, God, they've got the better argument. Then I would read the Orthodox argument and think, no, the Orthodox are right. I couldn't get it sorted in my head. But I remember telling the Lord, Lord, I'm at the point now where if I stayed Catholic out of intellectual conviction, my children might not stay Catholic because the only thing they'll see in their father is that his Catholic faith made him angry, just incandescently angry and mistrustful. Same with the mother. But I could get to heaven and say, Lord, my faith made me bitter, but I stayed Catholic. And I can't imagine that's what God would want. And I said, out of my brokenness and my desire for you, Lord, I think I can find you in the Orthodox Church, and I'm going to make this leap of faith. But if I'm doing the wrong thing, please forgive me. Know that I did it because I wanted you. And I think that was the right thing to do, not only because now I do have the clear conviction that the Orthodox are correct, but most of all, it was because I knew that to be a Christian is to live in deep committed relationship to Christ. And you could have told me that ahead of time. Anybody could, but I needed to feel it myself. And this is what I meant by my intellectual pride needed to be smashed. And this is why I don't even want to argue with people about apologetics anymore. I think those are important, whether you're evangelical, Orthodox, Catholic, those are important, but that's not me, because it was a temptation to me to intellectualize my faith. And then what I went through with my family down in Louisiana, it showed me that there was no way to healing other than through that kind of suffering that humbled me. It was our priest back then, Father Matthew Harrington, who was such a man of God. He told me, a lot of people, Rod, come to the church in pain, and wanting help. Some of them want a pill to take to hide the pain, but they don't want to do the actual hard work of repentance necessary to get well. Others are willing to take the surgery that will heal them. It might hurt more in the short term, but it's going to heal them in the long run. Well, I've lived that. I know that's true. And I know how much fidelity, what God can bring out of suffering if you suffer with him. In a more minor version, after I became a Christian in 1993, I was living in D.C., a single man, and I knew that I had to be chaste. That was the big stumbling block for me to why I wanted to keep God at arm's length, because I didn't want to surrender my God-given right as a young red-blooded American to have sexual liberty. Not that I used it that often, but it was the principle of the thing. I couldn't imagine giving that up. But I also knew, because I tried to live this way, like to make a deal with God, like I'll believe in you and I'll follow you 95% of the time, but on this, I need to hold it for myself. Well, that's fraudulent. You can't do that and be honest. And I knew that. So when I finally surrendered to God fully, I knew that this was going to be the main thing I had to overcome, is my unwillingness to be chaste. And I was chaste, and I had to die to myself. It was so difficult. I didn't have many friends, Catholic friends in Washington who shared that struggle with me. My friends were kind to me, but they thought I was really kind of weird. Why would you live this way? And I was terribly lonely for years. But I was only able to recognize after I met the woman I married that the Lord was using that time with me to refine me. I had to learn to die to myself and to reorder the passions in my heart to make me ready for marriage. If I had met Julie, whom I married, if I had met her at the beginning of my Christian walk, I might not have recognized the goodness in her. So I was able to look back at that desert experience of loneliness and self-denial and asceticism as a young man, dying, learning to be chaste. And I can see what God did for me, how he built that up within me. To this day, I've struggled with certain other things. I have different issues now that I struggle with, but I've been at this long enough to know that God has good at the end of this. If I just learn to trust him, and all the sacrifices that I'm able to make in my own life now, if I do it out of a loving heart and an obedient heart, that God will bring good out of it.
So you feel like you really relate to the suffering of these other people, even though it was maybe a little different than what you went through?
Well, I relate. I hesitate to say that, I'm doing just what you did, you people
Right.
who went to prison for, but it did help me. This last year, about a year ago, when COVID really kicked in, we couldn't have services at our church like a lot of people. A couple months go by, and boy, I really start to feel sorry for myself. I had a fellowship that I was supposed to go do in Budapest that got canceled. I couldn't travel anywhere. We couldn't have church. We couldn't have people over, on and on and on. And I fell into despondency. And then I remembered what I had learned in my research for Live Not by Lies. I remembered this man, Dr. Sylvester Krčméry. He was a young physician who became a leader in the underground church in Slovakia. They arrested him off the street in, I think, 1952 and put him in prison, where he stayed for a decade. He wrote a memoir in 1996 after communism was over called "This Saved Us." That's the name of the memoir in Slovak. And it was just a pretty thin book about the way that he conducted himself in prison, he and others, to keep their faith up, keep their hopes up. One of the things he said was, when he went into prison, he decided from the beginning that he could never feel sorry for himself, because if he felt sorry for himself, the bottom would fall out. He knew that he wouldn't be able to make it, because he had every reason to feel sorry for himself. I mean, they tortured him and others. But he said, I resigned myself to being God's probe. That's the word he used, God's probe. In other words, to find out how I can serve God here in prison, how I can deepen my own faith, my own conversion, how I can witness to others and help others who are suffering. And that framework was how he got through his own serious trial. And I remember thinking to myself then, the trial that you've been given, that the church in America has been given now through COVID, is a very, very mild trial. If we allow ourselves to be unhorsed by this, then our faith is very shallow indeed. So in that way, this relatively small suffering that I had to do and that others had to do because of COVID just seemed very mild compared to what they had to do. But the same principle helped me. The idea that don't complain about this, learn how to be steadfast. Because if you, talking to myself here, I thought if you can't be steadfast and hopeful and have inner peace in this kind of relatively mild trial, what are you going to do when they start coming for your business, when you get canceled, when this happens, or God forbid, if you should even be put in prison? So that's how it has worked for me, is to rearrange my stance towards suffering at all. I don't want to suffer. Look, I'm a hobbit. I live in great comfort, Aaron. Don't I'm not an ascetic here.
I'm with you. You know what? When I read about St. Paul, is it Philippians, where he talks about counting all things as loss, everything is rubbish compared to the glory? I'm like, I wish that's an aspirational statement for me. Yeah, I got to admit. But I can't honestly say that.
Let me pull this off. This icon I got in Russia. It's of a father and son who died in 20th century. This man is Father Alexei. No, sorry, I can't do it. There we are. That's his son, Father Sergei, and Father Alexei is the son, is the father. Father Alexei died in 1923 after the Bolshevik Revolution. His son, Father Sergei, took his church over, and Father Sergei died in the Gulag in the 1940s. I didn't know who these men were at all until I went to Russia and learned their story and learned about the importance of suffering. Father Alexei, the father of Father Sergei, he was not tortured by the Bolsheviks. He died fairly early in the revolution, but his son was tortured. But Father Alexei had suffered a lot in his life too. His wife had died, leaving him with all these kids. They lived in immense poverty. But let me set that down. But a priest came to him, a man that we now in the Orthodox Church call a saint, Father John of Kronstadt, came to see Father Alexei in all his poverty and said, listen, Father, you've been dealt a hard hand, but if you join your sufferings with Christ and with the sufferings of others, you'll find it easier to bear. And he did that, the little priest, and he ended up becoming one of the holiest men in Moscow. People would come to him from all over the city and outside the city seeking his counsel because of his fidelity and his holiness. But it happened when he got rid of his own despair by sharing it with others and learning to carry their burdens too. And then, of course, his own son died in prison in the Gulag. So these are just two ordinary men in Russia who lived extraordinary lives and whose story helped me. I ended up buying that icon at the church that they both pastored. It helps me understand what I'm called to be as a man and as a Christian, the burdens I'm called to bear, and what it means to be faithful. And whenever I start feeling sorry for myself, I not only think about what they went through, but I think about the counsel that John of Kronstadt gave to Father Alexei about this is just very human. Just reach out and realize that other people are carrying heavy burdens too. Help them out.
I've always said that the way, if you're really suffering, a pastor told me this one time. He's like, even when you're focused on your own problems, you're still focused on yourself. And you have to start focusing on other people. Find somebody who's got bigger problems than you and try to be a friend to them. And your own problems will start resolving themselves a little bit.
It's the soup kitchen. If I'd gone to Mother Teresa's soup kitchen, how would my walk with Christ have been different? And I think, Aaron, in this book, Live Not by Lies, I've got a number of chapters focusing on different aspects for which the former dissidents said that we need to focus on, like family, what we do in our families, what we do in small groups, things like that. But the key is the chapter 9 on suffering, because that, I think, is where the soft totalitarianism will take hold. Because we're so afraid to suffer. We're so afraid to be anxious because we don't know what it means. When I was in Birmingham last week in Alabama talking to a bunch of different Christians, this kept coming up that we just don't have a theology for that. Well, of course we have a theology for that. It's there in Scripture. It's in the history of the church. But we've just forgotten how to talk about it because we're so afraid of sending people away, of people not wanting to come into the church because it seems hard and off-putting, that we've forgotten how to talk about it and how to disciple ourselves and our congregations. But that has to be it. Suffering, that's the key. I remember standing on a street corner in Moscow after I interviewed Yuri Sipko. He was a former head of the Russian Baptist community there. Now he's retired, white-haired pastor. He'd grown up Baptist under Stalin. When all the men in their community had been sent to prison, it was up to the women to keep the faith alive and with the children. And Pastor Sipko told me they were standing with snow falling. He said, you go home to America and you tell the people that if they're not prepared to suffer for their faith, then their faith is nothing but hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. Powerful, powerful words.
Yeah. I mean, the stories in this book are very powerful. I mean, if nothing else, I mean, buy the book, Live Not by Lies, buy it, in order to just read the stories of people under communism. And, really, you realize, like, wow, these guys went through a lot. And I was thinking to myself, what does this really have to do with us in America? Under the soft totalitarianism seems different, but do you really think that America is really going to stay as a soft totalitarianism? Or, there's not really a great history of people staying with the soft totalitarian approach. They tend to degenerate. I mean, we already see today, essentially leftist paramilitaries, if you want to call them that, are able to go crazy whenever they want, commit acts of violence with impunity. Maybe it won't look like the Soviet Union, but maybe violence is going to come in different ways.
Yeah, I think so. And I tell people, this microphone is really good. It's picking up my Topo Chico.
There you go.
People ask me that. Well, don't you think it's going to turn hard? Yeah, it might. Solzhenitsyn said in the Gulag Archipelago, he talked about how if you went to the intellectuals, nice liberal intellectuals of the 1890s in Moscow, and told them that within 30 years, tortures, the likes of which have not been seen in Russia since the Middle Ages, were going to become common, they just wouldn't have been able to believe it. But it happened. And Solzhenitsyn said that this is something that people all over the world need to understand, that it can happen there. Everything that happened in Russia can happen in any country in the world, given the right circumstances. So I think it is entirely possible. But I think that the controllers will be able to get what they want without having to resort to those methods by using technology, by using an American version of the Chinese social credit system. This is something that a lot of Americans aren't aware of now, about how China, they know China is a totalitarian state, but it's also a very wealthy state and a powerful state, something that the Russians never had. China has figured out how to be both authoritarian and indeed totalitarian and capitalist at the same time, which wasn't supposed to happen, but it has happened. And what the Chinese do is they have this ingenious method called the social credit system that they've invented, and they're rolling out all over the country. And what it does is this. In China, it's mostly a cashless society. Most people do their daily transactions using their smartphones. And also they work online all the time. Well, the Chinese government hoovers up every bit of data from everything you do online, from all your transactions, your GPS coordinates, and they have also cameras, closed-circuit cameras on the streets that processes everything through facial recognition software and so on and so forth. What they end up having is a portrait of every single Chinese person that's constantly updated with data being fed into the computers. And the human beings never have to touch this. The algorithms figure it out. And so each Chinese person has assigned to them a social credit rating. And what the social credit rating does is says, how trustworthy are you? Now, how trustworthy are you according to the rules and regulations of the government? So if you, for example, download the speeches of Xi Jinping, they know it, the system knows it, and you'll get a higher social credit rating. If you are seen, or if you hang out with people who have low social credit scores, like church-going people or people who are dissidents, well, that's going to knock some points off your social credit rating. Again, even if nobody sees you, because they know you've been there, because they have your GPS coordinates, and so on and so forth. If you get a low enough score, Aaron, you are no longer able to buy or sell within the system. you're a no person. And so in this way, what we see in the book of Revelation about people who didn't take the mark of the beast, were unable to buy or sell, they can actually do that in China now. There's no reason why we can't do that here. We have the technological capabilities. The government is not the one hoovering up all this information on us now. Big companies are. When this is something that most people don't even realize, is that when you put a new app on your phone, for example, and nobody reads the fine print, you just say, yeah. You're giving them, and you click through so you can put the app on. You are giving the company the right to collect all kinds of data about you that they use to predict what you're going to want, what you're going to do. In Live Not by Lies, I talk about how some of this software is just incredible. They have developed this facial recognition software that they can put in smart TVs to monitor the faces of people who are watching an ad or a TV show, and they can know by the way you react what your inner state is, and it relays that back to the people, to the company. And what they're using it for now is to sell you things, to know at what point was the ad effective. But it's so easy to imagine that if you're watching the show and there's a transgender kiss or something, it can measure the reaction of everybody in the room and send it back. You don't have to be Orwell to understand how this can be misused. In China right now, I read something the other day, they have this in classrooms to monitor the faces of all the students in the classrooms to tell when they dissent from something taught to them in the lesson. I mean, this is not science fiction. This is happening right now. And I feel like that we are being so accustomed to giving over and trained to give over our privacy and to not to value privacy, so we can participate in modern culture, modern technology, that it won't be that hard for the future controllers, whether they're in private industry like Amazon, the Google, whatever, or the government, or the two of them working together to find ways to ferret out who the quote unquote domestic terrorists are, the bigots, those who threaten the system, and to punish them by refusing them to let them have access to the economy at a high level.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. We're already seeing it in a lot of places. This kind of Twitter replacement company, Gab, you probably heard of them.
Yeah.
They've been getting deplatformed from every place since 2017. They can't take credit cards. Banks won't take them as customers. Yep. And a lot of people don't like Gab, but it's like, this is exactly what they're doing to them, they'll do to you. Now, what I would say is I don't look at these things as private companies. They're very tightly linked to the state. I mean, how many Google people went to work in the Obama administration? Mm-hmm. These tech companies they're very in bed with the NSA, it. And so I would say they're essentially an extension of the state, of the ruling class in America. And I think other countries understand this, which is why China, I think, presciently kicked American tech companies out. We're like, we're not going to let foreign entities controlled or aligned with the U.S. state to acquire power over our country. And I think, it's one of the things, I think what I see with the soft totalitarianism, I think that these things have consequences that maybe they don't necessarily fully understand, the people who are in charge. So I think we're already seeing people starting to decouple from the United States, for example, like China's decoupled, Russia's decoupling to a great extent, India's starting to decouple. I think Europe is looking at how to maintain strategic autonomy from some of these things. So I think about this: if you're a head of state in Africa, are you going to source your tech stack from Silicon Valley or from China? I mean, I think it's like a no-brainer. You're going to want China. So I think it'll be interesting to see the fallout from some of this. There may be fallout for them that they don't fully get it.
Well, when I was in Poland, researching the book, I talked to Polish Catholics who work for the Polish branches of American and Western multinationals. And they were really upset because they were having to celebrate LGBT Pride Month in the office. And they sort of assumed that, this is part of Western business culture now. But it was to the point where they were afraid that they were afraid to say no to any of it, afraid that it would cost them their job. And they said, these are the best jobs in the country. These jobs are hard to get. What's going to happen to me? And it just made me so angry as an American that this cultural imperialism was coming to those countries through our companies.
Now, the origin of the poison is America.
Yeah.
It's not European. It's not Foucault and European intellectuals. I mean, we are the exporter of everything. We didn't. The idea that we imported all these crazy ideas from Europe, which is a very popular one, is just not true. The origin is here.
And just today, I put on my blog at the American Conservative a document that one of my readers leaked to me. I say leaked like it was a hidden document. I don't think it's hidden at all. It was just it was a statement by the Defense Department. It came out the other day, earlier this week, saying that the DoD is putting itself on combat footing to promote LGBTQI plus rights all around the country, or all around the world. I mean, it's just an extraordinary thing. It is. They are literally turning our soldiers into social justice warriors. And I asked on my blog the question, well, all right, so what happens if you're Hungary, which is a NATO ally, or Poland, also a NATO ally, or Turkey, a NATO ally, and because of the cultural and religious convictions of most people in your country, you're on the opposite side of what America wants. So now you have to consider American troops that are stationed in your country as part of the NATO alliance. Do they regard you as enemies because of that? I mean, it's extraordinary that we're doing this. I did not see the politicization of our military coming so fast, but man, is it ever here. And I don't know if you've served in the military or not, but
No.
my 17-year-old, I haven't either, but my 17-year-old son really wants to go into the military. He's a fine boy. He's a stout heart, wants to serve. But I'm thinking, do I really want him to be in an organization that sees people in other countries who believe what we believe as Christians, to see them as the enemy to be defeated because of that? And that's where we are, though, in this country. And so many Christians just can't bring themselves to see it. I think that there's a problem with the imagination here because, I'm 54 years old. I came of age in the Reagan 1980s. And it's really hard for people like me to see big business as the enemy. Believe me, I got there years ago, but it's still hard to talk to people of my generation and to have them think that, no, big business is at least as much an opponent of what you believe is true and good as the government is, and maybe even more. So you have something like Amazon recently. A lot of conservatives know this. They refused to sell Ryan T. Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, which is a very measured, well-reasoned critique of gender ideology. But Amazon just refused to sell it because they said later, explained that we're not going to sell any book that construes transgenderism as mental illness or as a mental problem. Well, you can say, well, too bad for Ryan Anderson, but Amazon has the right not to sell that book. And it does. It does have that right. But Amazon controls so much of the book market in this country, the retail market, that whatever decision it makes is going to set policy for the rest of publishing. So going forward, we are going to see no books published by any major publisher that in any way criticizes transgenderism because they couldn't get them sold. This is how things change, and this is too much power in a liberal democracy. This company, Amazon, has way too much power.
One of the things that struck me in the book is, obviously you'd say that the collapse of the Soviet communism was a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So if we're heading the same direction, would the fall of the U.S. regime be a good thing?
That's a dangerous question. I've never thought about it like that, but I'm going to give you my take on this, and then let you respond. But I'll give you some time to think about it. Okay.
That Alistair McIntyre quote, to me, it really has impressed me, the one that you took the Benedict Option from. And one of the things he said, I wrote it down, he said, a crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that Imperium. And I think we are so identified with the American Imperium, if you want to call it that. Do we need to cease to identify? Because obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was very bad in the short term. Life expectancy declined. Many people died earlier. Soviet Union was civilization, just like the Roman Empire was civilization. There was a cost to its decline. And so there will be a huge cost of kind of America's regime if you want to call it that, went into decline. But ultimately, when we would look at what it's become, is this not a form of another evil empire itself that should fall?
Yeah, I think we have to accept that possibility. And certainly as a Christian, I have believed for some time now that people like me, we are in exile, that this country is not, it ceased to be the shining city on the hill, and now it's more like Babylon. But as we know from Scripture, God called his people to their Babylonian exile for his own purposes. And God said, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, he told them, I have you here for a reason. So settle down, pray for the peace of the city, take wives, and so forth. So we have to realize that this is where we are as Christians now, but it is not our land in the way that it was before. That this is really problematic to be patriotic in the ways that our ancestors were about this country. But we also know too, Aaron, that and this is when I explained the Benedict option. I say we are in Jeremiah 29, but we also have to keep in mind from the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrew youth who were so embedded and assimilated into Babylonian society that they were there to serve the king, right? But they lived in a certain way as Hebrews so that they knew how far they could go, and that they knew that they would be better off dead than to betray God, the orders of the king. So I think that we here in this society today, wherever America's going, and I don't think it's going anywhere good, we need to be prepared to do what we did, live in such a way that we can have the same spirit and the presence of mind that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. So we know that ultimately God, we have to be prepared to suffer anything for the sake of God. And in terms of our own country, this is where I'm going with live not by lies, is that your country will turn against you, Christian, and it is happening right now. And if we're being tested now to see who our loyalty is to. Is our loyalty to the system? Is our loyalty to the government? I want to be a good citizen. I don't want to. I want to help my neighbors and be faithful to my country. But I don't want my country, my soldiers, to go out and treat other countries what they're doing now. I don't want all these things to be happening in our country. We are becoming evil, and not evil in the way that, say, the Soviet Union was, but evil nonetheless. And it's a very hard thing to wrap your mind around. But, this is maybe some illusion that we need to die to as American Christians. My wife grew up Southern Baptist, and she said, boy, to go in a Southern Baptist church, and on certain days they have, it's like I Love America Day. I forget, they actually have a name for it, where they would have pageants. She grew up at First Baptist Dallas. They would have all American pageants. I think there's a certain a mentality that conflates fidelity to Christ with fidelity to America. And ideally, it should be that way. I hope that America would stay faithful. But that's not happening now. We're turning our backs on the Lord. And we as Christians, if that means we have to turn our backs in whatever way on America to be faithful to Christ, God forbid that day should come. But if that day comes, then I pray that I have the strength to follow Christ no matter what.
Yeah, I got a nice comment here from Robert Hayes. This moment in history will force Christians to seriously consider what it means to be in this world, but not of it.
Yeah.
So that's a good comment there.
That's really true. And I talk about in the book, and Live Not by Lies, I bring up that great Terrence Malick film from a couple of years ago called A Hidden Life. It's the true story of Franz Jägerstätter, who was an Austrian farmer, Catholic farmer. They could not get away from Nazism. They lived in a small alpine village in Austria, and it was far away from the world, but Nazism found them there. But and most of the people in town conformed to what the Nazis wanted, but Franz and his wife did not, because they had lived in such a way prior to Nazism coming that they were able to recognize Hitler as an antichrist, and to know that come what may, they needed to be prepared to die rather than betray Christ to Hitler. And that's exactly what Franz did. He was killed in a Nazi prison. There's this great scene in there in which Franz goes to their little village church, and he sees an artist painting on the wall biblical scenes. And he talks to the artist about this, and the artist said, I paint these things to please people. Everyone likes to come here and see the pictures of Jesus and the saints and so on. But you realize that Christ doesn't call us to be admirers. He calls us to be disciples. And you determine who the disciples are and who the mere admirers are when it comes time to suffer.
Another, maybe not America itself, but something else that you seem to have a love-hate relationship with is liberalism. So in the book, you talk a lot about classical liberalism as sort of a positive contrast with communism. So one of the things you said was, quote, classical liberals are more concerned with individual freedom, while leftists embrace equality of outcome. And classical liberals favor a more or less limited role for the government, while leftists believe that achieving their vision of justice and virtue requires a heavier state hand, unquote. And there's a lot of mentions of classical liberalism. And yet, McIntyre probably wouldn't have been too keen on liberalism. Patrick Deneen, who I think you liked his book, Why Liberalism Failed, I think is the title of it. Talk about kind of liberalism as a failed project. How do you think about liberalism as a thing yourself? What is your, I think it's another one of these things where we're sort of like, I don't know, what do you think of it?
I'm contradictory. I'm divided. Have a divided mind on it. We think about the David French Sohrab Ahmari debate that was talked about a lot of conservatives. French is a defender of classical liberalism. Ahmari is a critic. And here's where I can't get settled on it. I agree with Deneen that liberalism has failed. We can see this all around us. But I think David French is right in one way. I think French is much more of an advocate of liberalism than I am. But for me, I think that if we don't have the First Amendment, which is the most important instantiation of liberalism, classical liberalism in our society, where are people like me going to hide? I think Ahmari is a so-called integralist or integralist. He wants to see a Catholic confessional state, which is a complete pipe dream. Whether it's a good idea or a bad, it's so unrealistic because the Catholics can't even get their own people to agree with the church authority. So that's just not going to happen.
With Pope Francis as the new emperor here.
Yeah, really. And as a non-Catholic, I would have problems with that anyway. But so we're going to have to depend on the First Amendment to protect what we can of our religious liberties. So if we lose the First Amendment, we're in a country that's post-Christian. It's not going to suddenly be a place that's friendly to us. I watched the Jericho March last fall and listened to some of that, in Washington, the pro-Trump Jericho March. And it really unnerved me. I thought, these are my people. Ostensibly, they're conservatives and they're Christians, but I didn't like a lot of what I heard. And if that is if that is an alternative to liberalism, well, where do I stand? The short answer, Aaron, is I really don't know. I'm divided on this because if we don't have the First Amendment, I don't know what we stand behind when they come for our churches and our schools and ourselves.
So we talked a little bit already. You think the solution, to the extent for the church today, is essentially the Benedict Option?
Yeah, I do. Form strong communities that it's no escape from anything. We can't escape this, right? Get that out of your head. If you think the Benedict Option, I'm not talking to you, Aaron, but to listeners, if you think the Benedict Option is about how we can get away from all this, it's not. It's how we can form communities so that we disciple ourselves and our kids and others to be resilient and to be able to withstand whatever they throw at us. We can see now, Aaron and I, when I was in Rome for the Italian edition of the Benedict Option, I gave a speech in Rome. A German Catholic came up to me. He happened to be in town that day and came to hear me speak. And he said, listen, we know in Germany, the things that you're talking about, they're going to happen. He said, the guy was, I guess, about 50. He said, I and my friends expect to live through the complete collapse of the institutional Catholic Church in Germany. But Catholic life has to continue some kind of way. So what we're doing, me and my friends, is we're having big families, and we are making it so our kids can meet each other and marry each other. And we believe this is the only viable long-term strategy until things change. I thought that was really sensible. This man was not despairing. He took a realistic measure of what was happening in his country and said the life of the church has to continue, and this is what we can do. What he was not doing is sitting around waiting for Rome to get its act together, the bishops to get their act together before he acted. And I think that this is wisdom that all Christians, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, can benefit from. We need to build these structures now, and not only build them, but live within them and live in ways that that build resilience within ourselves.
The Benedict Option, I read the book and I took a ton of notes on the book. I highlighted a bunch of passages, and I thought there was a lot in it. Now, what seemed to me about the Benedict Option is that the Benedict Option is sort of about building a fallout shelter, or like an ark. It's essentially a vessel for surviving the apocalypse. And you also wrote something back in 2016, a post that was one of my inspiration pieces for the Masculinists. It was called Retribalizing America. I don't know if you remember that one. You can look it up if you don't. You maybe write a lot. But you had a great quote in here. And it was about guys like Jack Donovan and different people like that, these kind of different, what you call pagan masculinist characters. And you said, eventually the provocations of the social justice warriors, especially when they are race-based, is going to empower the militant whites, especially those drawn to pagan masculinity, and they are going to do what the rest of us would not do, fight. This is because the best, that is those who want peace, civility, and tolerance, lack all conviction to defend the conditions under which we can have those things against their enemies. And the question, I've always wanted to ask is, why can't we fight? Why do we have to leave the field to the alt-right to do the fighting? Why not do some sort of fight back?
How could we do that? I mean, I'm not asking in a provocative way. I'm really trying to figure this out, because I think back in France, for example, back in 2012, 2013, when the government proposed a gay marriage law, there was this massive pushback. And the French are a pretty atheistic country, but there was a massive pushback, and not just from Catholics. They had a big demonstration in Paris called the Manif pour tous, the demonstration for everybody. They were arguing about how children need a mother and a father. That is the natural order. And they did not ultimately prevail. They prevailed in the short run. The government withdrew the law, but I think eventually it's now the law. But I remember thinking back then, wait a minute, we in America are supposed to be so much more conservative and so much more Christian, but we couldn't have a single demonstration like they had in France. Why is that? I think that there are so many ways that are legal that we could have been fighting all along. We could fight right now. Where are the demonstrations? Where's the pressure on Republican politicians to take firm, uncompromising stance on religious liberty? I wrote in the Benedict Option, Aaron, I don't know if you remember this, but I wrote about going to Capitol Hill to give a talk to a Christian group in the fall of 2015. This was a few months after Obergefell. After it was over, I was invited to have a private meeting with key Christian staffers from Republican congressmen on both sides of the Hill. And I remember sitting down with them and saying, oh, well, okay, we've lost Obergefell. That was a big blow. But so what are the Republicans going to be doing to shore up religious liberty for churches and Christian schools? Silence. There was silence there. And I posed it again. I thought, well, maybe I didn't say it the right way. Finally, one of them said, well, we don't have anything on the agenda. I realized then that we're sunk. The Republican Party will not stand with us. I don't know why. I think they are talking to other people on the Hill after that. They said, well, they're terrified of being called bigots. They can see that things have changed. And there was nothing that made us, no behavior from we who are Christians and conservatives and Republican voters to make them turn. And I think that probably the people who run the Republican Party and the Republican the GOP sphere in Washington know that they don't have anything to be afraid of from Christians. That Christians are going to vote Republican no matter what. And so they can just take us for granted. So I would, before we talk about going out there and doing insurrectionary things like some of the alt-right, there's so many things we can do that are perfectly legal and normal that would actually change things. But we don't do it. A lot of us think that if we just voted Trump, boy, that was going to turn everything around. I got so frustrated with my fellow Christians. I understand why Trump got elected. I didn't vote for him, But I was glad to see him come along and shake up the Republican Party. But so many Christians I know came to think that if they just voted Trump, Trump was in there, he was fighting, but he didn't actually get things done. You know what I mean?
No, I mean, he was it wasn't terrible, in every single respect, but he was certainly ineffective.
Yeah.
And I would certainly agree. Like, I think that the idea of change through the political process, if you want to call it that, is not going to work, because the left holds all the real levers of power in America. Yeah. But I'm always struck, like, if you look at like the kind of the radical leftists of previous generations, they were small, marginalized groups, but they were true believers.
Yeah.
And, decades later, their vision triumphed over kind of the you can think about maybe think about the new left of the 60s, whatever happened to the new left. Their vision triumphed over essentially, mid-century vital center liberalism.
Yeah, they marched to the institution.
And they've been able to do that. And I don't think there's, what worked for them won't work for us. So I don't think there's any march to the institution. But I do think this idea of people who really see the existing system as deserving of overthrow, who have a moral vision of society that they are working for, who are committed to kind of a long-term networking power acquisition, utilizing it, being, implacable foes. There's something to that. So, I mean, I think this idea, like, I think one of the things that the system wants you to be is demoralized and believe there's no hope. Yeah. And I think that I think that there are things that are like, it certainly looks very powerful. But I think there are things that are weaker. You mentioned the comforts. That's one of the things, like Marcuse mentioned that in One Dimensional Man, is like the Marxist revolution didn't come because advanced capitalist society bought off the proletariat with goods and services and essentially co-opted them into the system. And now I think, for if you're not in the top 20%, your material existence is in decline in America. Mm-hmm. Life expectancy is declining. So, standard of living declines a reality for a lot of people. And we're also kind of post-manufacturing consent in a sense that we no longer, now it's very obvious to everybody, even like progressive, pro-gay marriage, pro-everything, people on the left, that this is a coercive environment.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are living in fear. And that I think has profound consequences, because it's draining the legitimacy, right? Legitimacy is the coin of the realm in a lot of ways. And so I'm not saying that all these things are going to prompt the collapse of the country, but I think that we've done things, what we've done with banning Trump's accounts for Twitter, for example. We have no more moral authority around the world. People are never going to listen to us again when we talk about suppressing dissent or politicization of the military. I mean, the rest of the world increasingly is looking at us and going, "We don't want any part of this."
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think there's more opportunities maybe. I would like to see a Benedict Option. I love the Benedict Option, but I would like to see the idea of a Benedict Option focused not just on survival, but on being the seeds that are going to grow into a new reality. Mm-hmm. There's a more kind of a rebuilding and to going on an offense part of it at some point.
Yeah. Well, I do say in the book, I quote a lengthy quote from Pope Benedict XVI, what he said in 1969 when he was just Father Ratzinger. He predicted that the church's troubles were just beginning. Now, this was happening at the end of the 1960s, 4 years after the Catholics finished the Second Vatican Council, and they were so full of optimism. Ratzinger wasn't. He said the church is entering a time of trouble. It's going to lose its authority. It's going to lose its wealth, its power. It's going to lose everything. But the people are going to walk away from it. But those who are true believers will still stay, and they will bear any burden for the sake of Christ. And it is those believers who will plant the seeds for the rebirth, he said, because a world that has grown dark and cold and unbearably lonely will look to them and wonder, what do you have? You have something that we want, that we need. And so I've always said that the Benedict Option, it's survival, not just for the sake of survival, but survival so that in generations to come in the future, we will have nurtured those seeds within our communities and what institutions we have that survive in the same way that the monks did. And so we can replant it in the future. I don't say that we shouldn't fight. We got to fight as best we can, whether it's in court or politically, whatever, to stave this stuff off. But it's all that fighting is not going to work if we're not fighting for something, if we're not fighting for a way of life that is meaningful. I have so many people that I hear who, friends of mine, people I meet who are they know who the enemy is. They can look out there and see who the people who are coming for them are. At the same time, they still give their kids smartphones, or allow their kids to participate in this toxic culture, in this propagandizing that is teaching the kids to hate everything the parents are and believe in, because they're so afraid. Parents are so afraid that their kids are not going to be included. And Barry Weiss wrote this great piece. Maybe it was not for the Atlantic. I know maybe it was just for her website, but about, no, it was for City Journal, your old stomping grounds. Barry Weiss wrote about how crazy the very wealthy prep schools are now with racialist ideology and so forth, and how all these parents are horrified by what their kids are being taught. So why don't they pull their kids out of these places? Well, because they're afraid their kids aren't going to get into Harvard.
Right.
And at some point, something's got to break with these people, Aaron. They've got to say, like, why would you want your kid to get into Harvard and be part of this system that is so demoralizing and immoralizing and destructive? I had talking about this brings to mind a meeting I had, a luncheon meeting I had in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a couple of years ago with a friend who was a foreigner, a European who was doing graduate work at Harvard, and he was finishing up. And I said, so what have you learned the most important lesson you've learned about being here at the greatest American university? I didn't want to mention that LSU was really great. Because anyway, and he said, oh, that's easy. I've learned how fragile the American elite are. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He said, I've been sitting in classes where the tomorrow's rulers, the ruling class, are going to be, and are being trained and being groomed. And it is phenomenal to see how fragile they are. We've had professors in multiple classes say, like, well, we're not going to talk about this, this, and this, because some of you have come to me ahead of time and said it's triggering for you, so we won't discuss it. My friend said, most of us Europeans are on the left. And this freaks us out. We're like, why wouldn't you discuss this? Mm-hmm. But this is how fragile they are. And the professors yielded to these students who had the power. And my friend said, they're not, these students, they believe that it's their right to rule over this country, but this is how they are. They're so fragile they can't handle any disagreement. So this is it's very soft. What you're talking about, Aaron, we are facing something that's going to be totalitarian, and it's going to be soft in the sense that it's not going to come at us with gulags and secret police, but it is going to be totalitarianism. But it's soft in another way, because it is built on lies, on everybody having to pretend that that things are true that aren't true. At some point, the bridges are going to start falling down, so to speak, around us. So we're going to have to get back to reality. But as Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation.
Right. As we think about building Benedict options or taking action, who should we look to partner with? So you mentioned in the book the Charter 77 group in Czechoslovakia that Václav Benda had founded, and that he was basically the only Christian in it, and that there were even some radical Marxists who were in it who didn't like the system that was there.
Yeah.
What non-Christians would you suggest we partner with today, and which ones would you suggest we would not partner with today?
Well, as I said earlier, I've been really amazed by people like Barry Weiss, Brett Weinstein, Heather Heying, who've embraced the book because they too see the threats. They hate the authoritarianism too of the left. And I can remember it wasn't just Václav Benda's widow, Camilla, but all people in other parts of Eastern Europe who said that, listen, it was so difficult to stand against the system back in the day that when you found someone who was willing to courageously stand up and count themselves as opponents of the government, you knew that they were going to be your friend no matter what. That courage was the thing that made them stand out. Well, I think when you find people today in this culture who are willing to stand against wokeness and put something on the line and suffer for it, we need to think seriously about partnering with them purely strategically. Barry Weiss said to me, she said, if you had said to me 2 years ago, I mean, she's a lesbian, she's center left, but she said, 2 years ago, if you had said to me that I would ever consider myself an ally of Rod Dreher, I wouldn't have believed it. But here we are. Here we are. And I'm happy to fight with you. So people like that, I'm happy to fight with, even though we strongly disagree on some things. What she's fighting for, what they're fighting for, is the society in which you can disagree without having your livelihood ruined, you know? And I personally, I've said this in the Benedict Option, I think we have a lot to learn from Orthodox Jews.
I agree.
Modern Orthodox in particular, because you can look at the ones in Brooklyn, with the side curls and things, and there's a lot to learn from them too, but they've really stepped outside the mainstream. But modern Orthodox Jews, people like Yuval Levin and others, they have a lot to share with us. Abigail Schreier, who's testifying today on Capitol Hill, she wrote the book about about what transgenderism is doing to girls. She's an Orthodox Jew, and she's really being brave here and taking these incredibly courageous stances that you are not seeing a lot of Christian pastors take. So I
always say Jewish women have bigger balls than most Christian men. Unfortunately, I can't figure out why that is.
No, look, I'd rather be in the foxhole with Abigail Schreier and Barry Weiss than with a lot of Christians who just want to have made an idol of winsomeness, right? So I think those are people to look for. I can also remember somebody I used to know back in D.C. who worked for one of the religious liberty, Beckett or ADF, one of them, probably Beckett, who said that, listen, this guy was a Christian, and he said, but we know just the reality of it is in this country that it's better to have religious liberty cases carried forth by non-Christian plaintiffs because they'll get a more fair shot than Christian plaintiffs will. Well, I keep that in mind too, and I think about, are there Muslims I can partner with in who see what's going on and who will stand up and take a public stand, like in England a few years ago. Remember, it was the Muslim parents of this primary school who stood up and said, we're not going to have gender ideology taught to our elementary children. And they had the courage to do that, whereas a lot of English Christians did not. Similarly, in this country, we're starting to see in California, Asians stand up and fight against wokeness on race in schools. I don't know whether the Asians, some are Christians, some are not, but the fact that they're willing to say no more, we're not going to take this anymore. All right, I want to say, how can I help you? Because the system is our common enemy. We can sort out everything else later, but I want to preserve a system where it's possible for us all to work and to say what's on our mind and to practice our religion without having to fear that we will be destroyed.
All right. Well, do you have time to answer a couple questions from the audience here?
Yeah.
There are a couple of them on there.
Watching my dog over there wanting to get out.
It's okay. So we had a question from Joel. How should we talk to people who don't see a conflict between progressive ideology and Christianity? People often spout talking points of progressivism, thinking they're consistent with Christianity. Yeah.
Well, I guess it would depend on what the particular point is, but I would just go back to Scripture, and I would say, how can you reconcile this? Like, for the example, with race, the issue of race. We have so many people now in the Christian circles are taking up critical race theory. Well, there's a really interesting book coming out, I think next week or the next 2 weeks, by a Baptist pastor named Vodi Bokum, I think his name is. He's new to me, but I understand my Baptist friends say, oh, no, he's a big deal. He's black. And he just goes...
He's based.
He goes at critical race theory, hammer and tongs, and just obliterates it from a scriptural point of view, because he said that it separates people on the basis of race, and he shows clearly how anti-Christian critical race theory is. Well, I think you have to turn to people like that, and you have to say that if we believe that Christianity tells us what is true about the world, then how do we reconcile it with some of these claims that progressives are making about whether it's LGBT rights or race, things like that? There are ways in which we can hold up what they claim to what Scripture says and show how it's false. But I think that a lot of these people may believe that Christianity is moralistic therapeutic deism, that I can remember once being at a meeting. I was the only non-evangelical there. There's a bunch of middle class, upper middle class evangelicals. We were talking about transgenderism. This was 6 years ago. And one of them said, when can we finally get, one of the evangelicals there was upset with what a speaker was saying. And she said, when can we get past all this LGBT stuff and get back to preaching the gospel? And I thought, now that's really interesting there. She believes that this is something extraneous to the gospel. And what I'm guessing she believes, we didn't have a chance to talk, but that, praying the sinner's prayer and accepting Jesus into your heart, it's over and done. There's nothing else to be done here. Anything else is gravy. Well, I think that that's the sort of thing we have to talk about with these people is, well, what do you consider being a Christian is? What can a Christian do, and what must a Christian not do for the sake of being Christian? And if it's only about accepting Jesus as your personal savior or being baptized and then anything else goes, well, we've got a big problem there.
Mm. And then a question from a reader named Jeremiah would be interested in Rod Dreher's thoughts on relocation. When should we move out of our blue state and where to?
Well, yeah, so many people are going from California are relocating to Texas. And I would say as somebody who left the blue state to live in a red state, though for different reasons, for family reasons, I would say that it's good, but don't idealize it. I mean, where I live, Christianity is much more normative. I live in Louisiana, but wherever there is an internet connection, there will wokeness be also. In my own hometown, 1,800 people, Trump voting hometown, you have middle school same-sex couples going to middle school dances. It's happening there. The kids are being propagandized by social media. So what you do by moving to a red state is you just better your odds, but there is ultimately no escape from it. I have a friend who moved here from Virginia, Northern Virginia, and thought he was moving. He's a Christian, a serious Christian. He thought he was moving to a place that was much more solid, but he gets here and he finds out that he's Catholic. He finds out that to be a Catholic in Baton Rouge is to be middle-class person, and that in the actual Catholic schools, they're not so interested in teaching Catholic teaching, when it contradicts what respectable middle-class people are supposed to believe. And so it's been a real challenge for him because he didn't see that coming in Northern Virginia where he lived. I think he had his kids at an Opus Dei school where they were aware of how much to be a faithful Catholic meant that you stood in contradiction to so much in the world. And they factored that into their teaching. So you can find a lot of complacency in red states if you come there. That said, I'd much rather live in a place where you feel like it's much more of a neutral world, at least, than negative world, to use Aaron's designation, and then get involved in local politics, but and to try to build that firewall. But you'd be amazed, though, how many people, even in red states, are, as I said, they're so complacent. They think that it's not going to happen here. It's just not going to happen. This is something that happens in California, in New York. It happens.
What happens in California happens in every town in America soon enough.
Absolutely. And a lot of people move to my hometown thinking it's Mayberry. They're going to escape this stuff, but you don't escape it. As long as the internet is there, it's there, and you're going to have to deal with it. I talk to Christian school headmasters and teachers all the time from all over the country. And a lot of them say that the thing, and I was talking to one in New Orleans the other night when I was down there, they say that the thing is so many people, the Christian parents, think that they want their kids in a classical Christian school to get away from liberalism. And that just doesn't work. You send your kids there, you write the tuition check, but if you give your kids a smartphone or if you let them participate in pop culture outside of school, then everything the school's trying to do will amount to nothing. You've got school and church and parents all have to work symphonically together to form kids. And if one part of that triad is weak or not performing, it's not going to work. The discipleship of the kids is not going to work. So I would say move to a red state, absolutely, but don't think you're escaping anything. You're just buying yourself more time to build the networks you're going to need around you to protect yourself when the real trouble starts coming.
Right. Rod Dreher's new book is called Live Not by Lies. Pick it up today. Also get the Benedict Option. You need them both. There it is. Links are in the show notes, and you should subscribe to the Daily Dreher on Substack as well. And again, hit subscribe on YouTube, hit like, and go to themasculinist.com and get on the newsletter today. So, Rod, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk today.
Aaron, it's been great. I love your work. I admire it. You're doing great work for the church. And, I'd be glad to be in the foxhole with you, brother,
Okay,
and in
well,
the
good.
gulag if it comes to that.
Okay, well, good.
Okay.
Well, hopefully it doesn't come to that.
Let's hope.
All right.